The dust of the high street of Redemption Gulch was a fine choking powder that clung to the air and the skin. It was a town that had forgotten its name's promise, a place of hard hearts and sharp judgments. For Clara, a girl with nothing but the dress on her back and a few coins in her pocket, it was a world that had always felt cold. At 18, she had known more grief than most women twice her age. Orphaned and alone, she had worked to survive, her hands raw from scrubbing floors and her back aching from carrying sacks of flour. But her greatest crime was her innocence in a world that saw it as a weakness, a thing to be exploited. The town in its collective fury had found her guilty. A lie spun by the town's wealthiest man, a man named Silas Thorne, a man whose advances she had quietly, stubbornly refused. He had framed her for the theft of his prized pocket watch, a lie so grand and so baseless that it had taken root in the town's soil of gossip and resentment. Clara had no one to speak for her. The judge was a drunkard, the jury a collection of men who had long ago traded their souls for comfort. The verdict was swift and cruel, guilty. The sentence, death by hanging. As she stood on the gallows, the noose a coil of rope waiting for its purpose, she looked at the faces in the crowd. They were a blur of hard lines and cold eyes. No one cared. They saw her as a sinner, a thief, a blight on their small moral town. A tear, hot and defiant, slipped down her cheek. She was not crying for her life, but for the unfairness of it all. She had been innocent in every way, and yet here she was, on the precipice of a final unjust end. The sheriff, a man with a thick neck and a face like a slab of stone, took a step toward her. His hand reached for the noose. The crowd held its breath. The world seemed to shrink to a single point of no return. And then a sound cut through the silence. A sound that had no place in this world of white men and their harsh justice. The thunder of hooves, not of a single horse, but of many. A group of riders appeared on the edge of town, their painted faces and feathered headdresses a stark contrast to the drab clothing of the townsfolk. They were Apaches. A fear, cold and real, swept through the crowd. This was not a raiding party. Their movements were too purposeful, too silent. They stopped just short of the gallows, their horses blowing plumes of steam in the cool morning air. One man, taller than the rest, dismounted. He was a warrior, his face painted with symbols of strength and courage. His eyes, dark and ancient, were fixed on Clara. He wore no feathers, no grand display of power, only a simple hide tunic and a single strand of beads around his neck. He walked with a stillness that was both unnerving and beautiful. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence was a language all its own. The sheriff, his hand still frozen in mid-air, looked at the Apache with a mixture of fear and defiance. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. The warrior said nothing. He simply looked at the sheriff, and then he took another step forward, his gaze unwavering. He reached for his belt and unclipped a knife, a beautiful thing made of obsidian and bone. He cut the rope. The crowd gasped, a collective sound of shock and outrage. The noose, its purpose undone, fell from Clara's neck. The warrior then reached out his hand to Clara, his eyes those deep silent pools, a question she could not understand but felt in her soul. She took his hand. It was a moment that transcended language, a bridge built between two worlds that were meant to be enemies. She felt a jolt, a current of understanding that passed between them. It was a promise, a silent vow that he would protect her. He led her to his horse, helped her mount, and then without a word they rode away. A lone woman and a silent warrior, leaving the silent. Shock town behind them. His name, she would later learn, was Talon. He was an outcast among his own people, a warrior who had refused to fight in the wars that had consumed his tribe. He was a man who lived in the quiet shadows, a man who believed that peace was a greater strength than war. He had been a scout, a silent watcher, and had heard the town's shouts, the false accusations, and had seen the injustice of it all. He had seen a spirit that was not broken, a will that was still pure, and in a world of lies and cruelty, he had recognized the truth he had to protect. They rode for days through sun-drenched plains and across icy rivers. She was terrified, but she was also alive. She was a captive, but she was also free. He never spoke, but he would leave her food and water, would build a fire to keep her warm at night, and would watch over her as she slept, a silent guardian. They communicated in a language of gestures and glances, of shared silence and unspoken understanding. He would point to the sun and make a circling motion with his finger, a silent promise of a new day. He would point to the stars and trace a path in the sky, a silent testament to a journey that had no end. She found herself falling in love with his silence, with the way he saw the world, with the quiet dignity he carried. One day, they came to a hidden valley, a place of tall, ancient trees and a river that ran like liquid silver. It was his home. His people, a small isolated band, lived there. They were a people who had also been broken, a people who had also lost their way. They were suspicious of her, a white woman, an outsider. But Talon for the first time spoke. He spoke in a low, gentle voice, his words a stream of sounds she could not understand, but she knew he was telling them her story. He was telling them of her innocence, of her suffering, of her courage. He was telling them of her. The years that followed were a journey of healing and redemption. Clara learned their ways, learned to make fires without matches, to hunt with a bow and arrow, to speak their language, a language as ancient as the mountains that surrounded them. She became a part of them, a part of a family that she had never known. She and Talon were inseparable. Their love was a quiet thing, a silent understanding that passed between them. They had both been broken, both had lost their way, and in each other they had found a piece of themselves they thought was lost forever. But the past, a stubborn, hungry ghost, was not done with them. Silas Thorne, the man who had framed her, had never forgotten his humiliation. He had spent years searching for her, his fury a bitter poison in his soul. He had heard whispers of a white woman living among the Apaches, a woman who had a warrior as a protector. He came to the valley with a band of his own men, a group of mercenaries as cold and cruel as he was. They arrived at the valley, a group of armed men, a brutal invasion of a peaceful world. The town, which had once been a silent mob of judgment, was now a small army of hatred. "I've come for her," Silas said, his voice a low, triumphant growl. "The thief. She belongs to us. We have a debt to settle." Clara stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest, but her gaze was unwavering. She was not the same girl he had sentenced to death. She was a woman of the wilderness, a woman who had found her strength in a world she had never known. "I am not a thief," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You are the thief. You stole my life from me. You stole my freedom." Silas laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the valley. "You think you can challenge me, a man with 100 men at my back?" But he was wrong. He was not a man with 100 men at his back. He was a man alone. The men he had brought with him, seeing the quiet, unyielding strength of Talon and his people, began to back away, a silent retreat. They had no quarrel with these people. They had no interest in a man who would send them to their deaths for a lie. Talon stepped forward, his body a solid, immovable presence between Clara and the man who had wronged her. He did not speak, but his gaze, a silent, unwavering force, was a message all its own. He was a man who had chosen peace, but he was also a warrior, and he would not let this man take his family. "Go," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The words were simple, a single command, but they held a lifetime of unspoken promises. They were a promise of love, a promise of a future, a promise that he would not let this man break his heart again. Silas, a man who had never known fear, felt a cold knot of it form in his stomach. He had faced down outlaws and thieves, but he had never faced a love so powerful, a love so pure that it was a force of nature. He saw the love in Talon's eyes, the love that had been given freely, unconditionally. He saw a man who was ready to die for a woman who was not his own. He saw a man who had been broken, but was now a force of nature. He saw a love so powerful it could not be defeated. And in that moment, he knew he had lost. He turned and fled. A man defeated not by violence, but by a love so strong it was an unbreakable thing. The town, which had once been a place of cold indifference, was now a place of hope. The people, who had once turned their backs on a girl's suffering, now stood together, a community that had finally learned to love. Talon and Clara stood together, two people who had been broken, but who had found healing in each other. They were a family, not by blood, but by a love so profound it transcended all. They had found redemption, not in a town that had been rebuilt, but in a love that had been. They looked at each other, and in their eyes they saw a future filled with the laughter of a new family and the warmth of a new unbreakable love. They had found their home, not in a place but in each other.